The wind moves differently here, the grass never seems to grow over this patch of earth, and the stone marker, just a rough piece of rock, is colder than the rest. Locals walk past quickly, some crossing themselves, others pretending not to notice. They don't speak of who lies beneath, and for over 100 years no one has dared to carve a name into the stone. It is a grave, but it is also a warning. Because whoever this child was, the town wanted them forgotten so completely, it was as if they had never been born. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It starts with a cemetery, the kind you've driven past 100 times without ever noticing. Old stones leaning, cracked, some names worn down to nothing but shadows on grey granite. But there's one grave here that has no name at all, just a small marker, tucked away at the edge, like the town itself tried to push it out of memory. No flowers, no family, no record of who rests beneath. And yet, if you ask the older folks who grew up here, their voices lower when they talk about it. Some will tell you it's cursed. Others say it was a child, one the town wanted to forget. For nearly a century, no one spoke the truth, but buried in archives, tucked between brittle sheets of court documents and yellowing newspaper clippings, lies a story of a family destroyed, a community complicit, and a child erased from history before they ever had a chance to live. This isn't a ghost story. It's worse. It's a real one. And by the time we're done, you may find yourself wondering just how many nameless graves exist across America, each holding a story someone wanted silenced forever. The tale begins in the early 1900s in a rural town that was already shrinking before it ever had a chance to grow. Poverty pressed in on everyone, farms struggled, and whispers carried more weight than truth. It was the kind of place where neighbors watched each other too closely, where secrets spread faster than wildfire, and where once a rumor took hold, it stuck like tar. And in this place, in this moment, a child came into the world. Not welcomed, not celebrated, not even fully acknowledged. Their birth was shadowed by shame, whispered about behind closed doors, denied in daylight. The church would not baptize them, the neighbors refused to acknowledge them, and the family, broken by its own sins, had already decided this child would never carry their name. So the baby was buried before they ever had a chance to live freely, not only in the earth but in silence, a grave without a name, a life erased on purpose. But the soil keeps secrets, and if you dig deep enough, you'll find the truth waiting. The story begins with a house. A farmhouse, really, though calling it that gives it more dignity than it ever deserved. Its roof sagged even when it was new, its boards never quite sealed against the cold, and the walls seemed to lean in on the family that lived inside. It was here, behind those thin wooden walls, that the whispers began. The family carried a name that once meant something in town, back when land was plentiful and crops grew strong. But by the turn of the century, their fortunes had withered. What remained was not wealth or respect, but a reputation tangled in rumors of cruelty, of shame, and of things that polite society refused to name aloud. The men of the family drank too much. The women, neighbors whispered, suffered too quietly. And in that house, sometime in the dead of winter, a child was born under circumstances that no one dared record officially. No birth announcement, no christening, not even the local doctor's name on a certificate. Nothing to mark the child's existence but hushed voices, and later a small grave carved into frozen ground. But here is where the details fracture. Some say the child was the product of a forbidden union, a sin the family wanted hidden. Others whisper darker things, that the child's existence revealed something the family could never admit without destroying themselves. And in towns like this, where everyone watched each other's windows and judged each other's footsteps, the easiest way to control a story was to erase it altogether. The mother, who she was, what she endured, how she carried this child into the world, is barely remembered. Her name appears in fragments across census records, fading and misspelled, like someone wanted to blur her from history as much as the child. The father's role, spoken of in tones too low to catch, as though even now the truth might bring shame on those who still carry the family name. All that remains certain is this: the child did not live long, and when death came it was not met with mourning, no obituary, no funeral procession, just a hurried burial at the edge of consecrated ground where the church would not dare to sanction, and the neighbors would not dare to look. The stone laid down was plain, unmarked and cruel in its silence, a deliberate silence, a silence that said, this child never existed, and yet, here we are, still speaking their story a century later against the will of those who tried to bury it. A nameless grave does not stay quiet on its own. It is kept quiet by a town, by a church, by the very people who walk past it each day and choose not to see. And in this story, the silence of the grave was not born from ignorance, but from agreement. The community knew. They always knew. Whispers traveled down the narrow dirt roads, carried by women at wells and men in smoke-filled taverns. Everyone had a version of the story, a detail too sharp to be coincidence, too specific to be imagination. They said the baby looked too much like someone it shouldn't. They said the mother's cries during labor were muffled not just by the walls of the house, but by the fear of what those cries revealed. And still, they kept their distance. It was easier for the town to condemn than to confront, easier to treat the child not as innocent, but as a mark of sin. In small-town America at the dawn of the 20th century, morality was a weapon. Churches preached salvation on Sundays, but turned their backs on the vulnerable come Monday morning, and for the child in the nameless grave, salvation was never offered. Records from that time show gaps where there should have been entries, a missing baptism, a missing census count, a missing obituary. These were not oversights, they were choices. A deliberate erasure carried out by neighbors who decided it was better to pretend this child had never lived, better for their peace, better for their reputations, better for their sense of moral order. But silence leaves traces. It seeps into the next generation. Children grew up warned never to ask about the grave at the edge of the cemetery. They were told it was bad luck, or that no one important lay there. Some dared each other to run past it at night, never knowing the truth of whose memory they were running from. And in those warnings, in those fearful glances, the story endured even as the name did not. To erase someone is to believe the past can be controlled, but graves, even nameless ones, refuse to stay hidden forever. Eventually someone asks the forbidden question, who was this child, and why did the town try so hard to make us forget? And the answers lead not just to tragedy, but to a revelation that would fracture the community's image of itself. The deeper you dig into the family behind the grave, the darker the soil becomes. Their name, once carved into land deeds and respected in town meetings, had by then become a shadow whispered with unease. They were not outsiders. They were the roots of the community. But roots can rot beneath the surface, and no one wants to admit the tree is dying. The patriarch, remembered only in fragments, was a man of contradictions. In public, stern and commanding. In private, stories suggest he was something else entirely. Old court records mention violence, charges dismissed, testimonies lost. Neighbors hinted at tempers that split the air like a storm, and within his own home, fear seemed to be the only inheritance passed down. The mother's story is quieter but no less tragic. Photographs show her as a blurred figure in the background, rarely at the center, her face carrying the hollow look of someone who has survived more than she could ever say aloud. By the time the child was born, she was already broken by silence, and silence, as always, was the most dangerous part of the household. What makes the nameless grave unbearable to think about is not just the child's death, but the possibility of what that child represented. Some whispers say the baby's father was not an outsider at all, but someone under the same roof. A truth too corrosive for a town built on reputation and respectability to ever allow into daylight. Imagine the weight of that secret, A child carrying the evidence of betrayal, violence, and bloodlines twisted together. Imagine a family so terrified of exposure that they believed the only answer was erasure. Not protection, not confession, erasure. The neighbors may have judged, but they also protected the illusion. To expose the truth would have meant facing the cruelty of people they saw in church pews, in fields, in shops. It was easier to look away. 2. Treat the grave as something unworthy of memory, to let the silence become the soil that covered the child's name. And so, the town lived on. Families grew. Children played in streets that wound past the cemetery. Life moved forward. But the grave did not change. It stayed there, empty of words, but heavy with meaning. A reminder of what was buried, not just a life, but a truth no one dared face. It is in these silences, these deliberate omissions, that history becomes most dangerous. Because the nameless grave is not only about one child, it is about what a community was willing to sacrifice to preserve its image. Time has a way of softening most stories. Scandals become anecdotes, tragedies turn into lessons, and even the darkest moments fade into folklore. But the nameless grave never softened. Instead, it hardened, becoming a place the community avoided, yet could never fully erase. By the 1930s and 40s, the first generation who had known the truth began to pass away. With them went the sharpest memories, the details that might have explained the child's short life. What remained was something more haunting, fragments, half-whispers, and an unease that no one could quite put words to. Children were told never to play near the edge of the cemetery. Teenagers dared each other to touch the stone at midnight, swearing they felt a chill run through their bones. And adults, when pressed, would only shake their heads and mutter that some things were better left buried. In America, folklore often hides uncomfortable truths. A town will turn a shameful history into a ghost story because it's easier to believe in curses than in cruelty. And so the nameless grave became a local legend, a point of fear and fascination. People claimed to see strange lights flickering near the stone. They told stories of hearing a baby's cry carried on the wind. The grave became more than a marker. It became a symbol of unfinished business, a haunting that belonged not to the child, but to the town itself. But what is haunting really, if not memory refusing to stay silent? Behind every eerie tale of a child's spirit was the weight of the truth, an unspoken acknowledgement that a real life had been erased and that erasure demanded to be noticed. In dusty town records, in censuses with missing names, in church logs with carefully drawn lines through certain entries, the silence still left its fingerprints, and for historians and genealogists decades later, those silences raised alarms. Something had happened. Ned here, something no one wanted to claim. By mid-century, families who had once lived in the shadow of the story began to scatter. The farm that birthed the scandal fell into disrepair, its boards collapsing inward like a secret finally collapsing under its own weight. Yet the grave remained, small, nameless, untouched. The earth does not forget, even when people choose to. And the question grew louder for those who dared to ask, what kind of truth is so unbearable that an entire community would choose silence over memory? The deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that the nameless grave is not simply a symbol of loss, it is evidence. Evidence of choices made in shadow, and of a story deliberately torn out of the town's history. When researchers began digging through old archives in the county courthouse, they found what the community had hoped would never resurface. Pages missing from birth records, a baptismal register with a blank line where a child's name should have been, property disputes that hinted at internal family fractures, sudden transfers of land, signatures that appeared under duress. Piece by piece, the paper trail told the same story the grave had been screaming for a century. Something had been buried here, something more than a child. And here lies the cruelty of silence. By refusing to name the child, the town ensured they could not be claimed by anyone. Not by history, not by memory, not even by blood. The nameless grave is not just a marker of one life cut short, but of a community's complicity. The baby was buried in earth, but the truth was buried in silence. Both graves remain. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken the truth or carried the silence forward? Because make no mistake, this was not an isolated tragedy. Across America, in towns just like this one, families hid their darkest secrets beneath layers of respectability, and when the evidence threatened to surface, it was always the most vulnerable who paid the price. Women silenced, children erased, graves left nameless. Some historians now believe that this grave, this child, was not only unwanted, but forbidden, that their very existence threatened to unravel the delicate fabric of the town's moral image, that their life, short as it was, revealed a sin too intimate, too shameful, too, dangerous to be allowed into daylight. And so, the community did what communities often do when confronted with unbearable truth. They agreed, silently and collectively, to forget. But forgetting leaves cracks, and when you press your ear to the past, sometimes you can still hear what they tried so hard to bury. By the 1970s, the town had changed. New roads had been built, new families had moved in, and the original scandal was nearly 3 generations behind. But the grave was still there, and it still unsettled those who noticed it. For newcomers, it was simply odd. Why would a child's grave have no name? For old families, it was something more, a reminder of what they were never allowed to say. Children who grew up in that era recall being told contradictory stories. Some were told the child never existed at all, that the marker was only a boundary stone. Others were warned never to touch it, as though doing so would invite misfortune. But in the way children do, they felt the tension in their parents' voices, the unease that betrayed the weight of something unspoken. And then came the genealogists. As America entered a new wave of interest in ancestry, people began to dig through their roots. Family trees were charted, names collected, lines traced back through census pages. And there, always, was a gap, a missing branch, a space where something had been removed. Some families tried to explain it away as a stillbirth or as a record lost to time. But for others, the evidence was too consistent, too deliberate to ignore. What haunted these later generations was not just the grave itself, but the silence handed down like an heirloom, grandparents who refused to speak of it, parents who dismissed questions with sharpness that revealed more than they concealed. The truth was not just buried in the ground, it was buried in bloodlines, and that silence, that refusal to acknowledge, became its own form of inheritance. One former resident, interviewed decades later, described walking past the grave as a child. It always felt wrong, like someone was supposed to be remembered, and everyone around me was pretending they weren't there. It was like being told not to see something that was right in front of your face. The nameless grave was not just a symbol of a life erased, it became a mirror that reflected back the ways communities choose silence over justice, image over truth. And for those who carried fragments of the story in their families, it became a weight they could never quite put down. Because silence doesn't end when the first generation dies. It seeps into the next, and the next, shaping lives long after the original act of erasure. And in the case of the nameless grave, that silence became the town's most enduring inheritance. The further you pull back, the more disturbing the pattern becomes. The nameless grave was not an anomaly. It was part of a much larger, unspoken truth across America's landscape. Small towns filled with silences, erased children, and histories rewritten to protect the living at the expense of the dead. Across rural cemeteries, researchers have found similar stones. Some are marked only with the word infant. Others bear no carving at all, just a rock pushed into the soil as a token gesture. Each one raises the same question: who decided this life was unworthy of memory, and why? The truth is that America was built not only on land and labor, but on silence. Communities learned quickly that to preserve reputations, you had to control the story. If a child was born under circumstances too scandalous, too shameful, or too violent, the answer was simple: they were erased. Their records burned, their names omitted, their graves left blank. And the neighbors, the churches, even the authorities looked away. In many cases, these erasures point back to the same kinds of truths suggested by the nameless grave we've been following: family secrets, generational abuse, forbidden bloodlines. To admit such truths would have been to unravel the moral order of the town, and so the order was preserved, not by justice but by silence. But silence has a cost. For every grave without a name, there were mothers who carried trauma they could never speak of. There were siblings who grew up with questions that no one would answer. There were descendants left to carry shame they did not earn. The nameless grave was not just the end of one child's story. It was the beginning of a legacy of denial. And what makes it most haunting is that these graves were never meant to be found again. The families believed that with enough silence, enough erasure, time itself would cooperate, and the memory would dissolve. But here, a century later, we are still talking about it, still digging, still asking, still breaking the silence they fought to maintain. The nameless grave then becomes more than a tragedy. It becomes a rebellion against erasure. Its very existence, its refusal to disappear, forces us to confront the darkest truth of all, that forgetting was never about protecting the child. It was always about protecting the guilty. In recent years, the nameless grave has drawn attention again, not from locals eager to preserve the old silence, but from outsiders who see it for what it is, a wound in the earth that refuses to close. Historians, amateur researchers, even descendants who fled the town generations ago have begun to ask questions, and with questions comes resistance. Some in the community still refuse to speak. They call the grave private family business, or insist that it's best left alone. But their defensiveness reveals something important, that the shame which silenced the first generation has not vanished. It still hangs over the living, a shadow inherited like an heirloom nobody wanted. For those who dare to look, the grave has become a point of reckoning. DNA testing, genealogical records, and the digitization of archives have begun to crack open secrets that once seemed untouchable. And in the fragments uncovered, letters tucked into Bibles, court files long buried in basement boxes, the whispers of truth grow louder. They reveal a story not just of a child denied their name, but of a family, and perhaps even a town, that chose silence over honesty, reputation over justice. And here is where the grave's meaning shifts. For decades, it was a place of fear, of avoidance. Now, it has become a symbol of accountability, a reminder that no matter how carefully you bury the past, time will dig it up again. The soil cannot hold secrets forever. For descendants, the reckoning is personal. Imagine tracing your family tree, expecting to find pride and legacy, only to stumble upon an empty space, a missing name, a child unacknowledged. Imagine learning that your bloodline carries not just silence, but the weight of a crime no one dared confess. For some, this truth shatters the stories they were told about their family's honor. For others, it explains the silence that hung over their child, stood like an unspoken curse. The nameless grave, once ignored, now forces questions into the open, and for a community that once built its survival on silence, those questions are more dangerous than the grave itself ever was, because the truth once uncovered does not only haunt the dead, it haunts the living. The nameless grave still sits at the edge of the cemetery, quiet, unmarked, and weathered by more than a century of rain and wind. To most who pass, it is nothing more than a stone. But to those who know, it is a monument, not to a child forgotten, but to the lengths people will go to erase the truth. In that small patch of earth lies a story that was never meant to survive. A child born into silence, buried in secrecy, erased from memory. A community complicit in turning away. A family so consumed with protecting its name that it sacrificed one of its own to the shadows. And yet, despite all the efforts to bury it, the truth has endured. Not in records, not in monuments, but in the whispers, in the unease, in the refusal of the grave to disappear. What makes the story of the Nameless Grave so haunting is not just what it reveals about one family or one town, but what it says about all of us. How many other graves like this exist across America? How many silences have been passed down, inherited like curses, shaping families who don't even know the truth they carry? How many lives were erased because someone decided their existence was too dangerous to admit? The Nameless Grave is a reminder that history is not only written in ink, but in omissions. That sometimes the most important stories are the ones missing from the records, the ones carved into unmarked stones, the ones whispered too softly to hear, until someone chooses to listen. And so, as we leave this story, we are left with a choice. To look away, as the town once did, and let the silence swallow this child again, or to remember that even a life denied a name deserves to be spoken of, deserves to be seen, deserves to be mourned. Because in the end, silence is never neutral. It protects the powerful, and it buries the vulnerable. And the Nameless Grave, still standing, still refusing to vanish, is proof too, that the truth always waits, no matter how deep you bury it. So the next time you pass a cemetery, look closely. Look at the edges, the forgotten corners, the stones without names. Ask yourself, whose story was buried here, and why were you never meant to know it?